Ah, the Celts. So much more than just a basketball team. Probably. No one really seems to agree. The ancient Celts certainly were a proud, industrious, and fierce race of people spreading out over much of the continent of Europe and even beyond, as I discussed long ago, with Celtic peoples once ruling in Iberia, Turkey, Germany, and Romania, despite now presumably being relegated to the fringes of the European continent and the backlogs of history. But as I discussed, truly the most impressive feat of the Celts was not their conquest of Europe in the Old World, but in the New, as just how the Basques, an ethnic minority in Spain, had a truly inordinate amount of power and influence in Spain's early New World colonies, the Celts had a large presence in early British settlements and colonies as well, with many founding fathers, and just about every single president the United States has ever produced being of at least partial Celtic descent, and the American national identity quickly became a fusion of the British constituent nations of not only the English, but the Irish, Scottish, and Welsh. So who are the Celts exactly? Well, the Celts were one of the most prominent Indo-European peoples across the bulk of mainland Europe, with the ancient Celtic settlements in Anatolia giving birth to the Galatians, having originated from migrants from Gaul in modern-day Western Europe. However, gradually over the centuries, due to the Latinization of much of the territory of the area conquered by the Roman Empire and the Germanization of much of the territory conquered by the Germanic tribes during the migration period, the bulk of the Celtic homeland on the mainland of Europe was erased. Thus leaves us with the modern-day nations that still identify as Celtic today, mainly located in the British and Irish Isles and the Breton Peninsula in France, although Celtic influence can still be found in many people groups of Europe, such as the Raetians of the Alps, and today the remaining Celts have some of the most distinguishing cultures and phenotypic traits of any group native to Europe. Now, as I mentioned several times in the past, it's very difficult to actually distinguish modern Englishmen as an ethnic identity in the British Isles, genetically and linguistically speaking, as although the language, English, is primarily Germanic in origin, they have had such an utterly massive amount of influence from the native Celtic languages, Latin from the old Roman settlers in Britain, French from the Norman invasions and conquest, and of course has borrowed loanwords from just about every continent. Genetic studies reveal that the maternal DNA of modern Englishmen is mostly Celtic in origin, while their paternal DNA more or less matches that of the Germanic invaders who settled the island, suggesting a mass invasion of Germanic people who took native wives or concubines, enforcing their own values, culture, and language onto their offspring. So the English, Irish, Scots, and Welsh are inextricably linked, not only through culture, but also through blood, and Viking raids and settlements throughout the islands complicates this even further, as there was actually a Norse language known as Norn, spoken on the islands of Shetland, Orkney, and parts of northern Scotland up until the 19th century. The Celtic languages are still spoken natively by a small minority on the fringes of the Isles, particularly in the Hebrides and parts of the Republic of Ireland, despite nearly having been replaced by English in modern times, although similarly to Basque, there has recently been a strong linguistic and ethnic revival movement and a particularly strong push in Wales and Ireland to learn the languages of their ancestors, and even Celtic languages that had previously gone extinct in the recent past, such as Manx on the Isle of Man and Cornish and Cornwall, are now being revived as second language speakers. Outside of these 6 traditional Celtic nations of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Man, Cornwall, and Brittany, there is additionally quite the quirky group known as the Ulster Scots, better known in North America as the Scots Irish or Scotch-Irish. The Scots Irish were the result of Protestant migrants from Scotland and northern England settling in the Ulster region of the northern half of Ireland in the 1600s, who largely integrated with the native Irish over the generations but still have a distinct ethnic heritage. But contrary to the name, Scots Irish does not necessarily denote someone who is half Irish and half Scottish, as many assume. For much of its history, the Kingdom of England held enormous sway and influence over the nations of the British Isles, with Wales being the first to be incorporated into what would become the United Kingdom, and hence the Welsh, at least those who had been thoroughly Anglicanized, were very heavily involved in early British colonial endeavors, including slavery in the United States. It should be noted that the number of Welsh Americans is likely far higher than the official statistics in the United States Census, considering that about 5 to 6% of the non-Hispanic white population of the U.S. has a Welsh surname, including the likes of Jones, Williams, Lewis, Evans, Thomas, and Smith, among others. Keep in mind this is compared to over 8% of blacks that bear a Welsh surname due to the abundance of Welsh plantation owners in the South, which doesn't necessarily ensure they would have Welsh heritage, but definitely increases the chances, ironically making black Americans more likely to have Welsh ancestry than white Americans as a whole. The Scots Irish were also some of the first Celtic migrants to the Americas outside of mainland Britain, and typically settled on the frontier regions of the colonies, often shouldering the brunt of pioneering trails and interacting with Native American tribes, with mixed outcomes. Literally speaking, as many know, in Appalachia, Scots Irish and Native American heritage go together like moonshine and rhubarb pie. Although admittedly, even though many Southern whites claim Native heritage, the percentage with any discernible Native American ancestry whatsoever is likely in the single digits. Later on, when more Anglo settlers began to arrive in this region of Kentucky, Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and other southern states, these Scots-Irish and other Celtic migrants more or less fused with the incoming Americans of English stock, with little cultural and/or ethnic differences perceived between them after so many generations of cohabitating in North America. And for this reason, the vast majority of Southern whites likely have some kind of hybridized ancestry from all the nations of the British Isles. So, although the English language may indeed have won out, the ways in which Celtic culture has impacted the South and the entire U.S. is insurmountable. Early records and studies show just how pervasive Celts were in early America, with, at the time of independence, nearly 20% of the American population being descended from Celtic migrants from any of the recently absorbed Celtic nations of the British Empire. And it's actually pretty crazy that we have more reliable demographic data on America in the 1700s than we do in many countries today, as you could see from these reconstructed ethnic maps of the colonies. Even to the north, many in Ontario, then known as Upper Canada, were of Irish or Scottish heritage, with many of the early pioneers that traveled west in that country also being of Celtic ancestry, and there is, even to this day, a population of Métis in the prairies, or mixed Canadians of Scottish and Cree origin, as opposed to most Métis, who are descended from Frenchmen. Of course, the Scots had the highly successful colony of New Scotland, or Nova Scotia, which remained inhabited by Scots from its initial settlement in the 17th century up until its corporation into the British Empire when the Kingdom of Scotland was annexed in 1707. In the present day, nearly a third of Nova Scotia's population claims Scottish heritage, including over half of the population of the northern parts and Cape Breton Island, making it the most Scottish place in the world outside of Scotland, and in neighboring Prince Edward Island, this rises up even higher to nearly 40% as a whole. In fact, Scottish Gaelic is still spoken in the maritime regions of Canada by a handful of citizens whose ancestors can be traced back in the region for centuries, although the last monolingual Gaelic speaker died in the 20th century. Again, the number of immigrants from these periphery regions of the British Isles was outrageously skewed, as in many areas of Ireland or Scotland, around 50 or 60% of the working-age population was virtually evacuated to the U.S. from some villages or towns in only a generation. The ratio of Celts native to the British Isles versus those located in North America is so insanely unbalanced, likely being outnumbered by the descendants in America and Canada by a ratio of 6 to 1, that Celtic identity has also been heavily influenced by a backwards cultural transfer from America back to the British Isles, and as I've mentioned, the ethnic lines between the English and those of Celtic ancestry in America are heavily blurred, and in some cases nearly entirely absent. However, this is definitely not true back in Europe in the present day, and definitely from a historical perspective, as anyone with a rudimentary history of large American cities can tell you of the mistreatment and discrimination leveled at the Irish especially, due in no small part to their Catholic faith. In the Boston metropolitan area, roughly 1 in 3 people have Irish heritage, meaning Boston has the highest number of Irish people of any metro area in the world, even more than Dublin, New York, London, or Chicago, and the state of Massachusetts certainly has the highest degree of Celtic ancestry percentage-wise in the U.S., followed by other states in the New England region. Irish immigrants, however, permeated every single U.S. state, even as far away as Alaska or Hawaii, not to mention how interstate migration has guaranteed the dispersal throughout the entire country, as you can see here with areas of a ethnic Celtic plurality highlighted in yellow. In recent years, it certainly is true that the Celtic and Western European component as a whole in the United States and Canada is waning, although it is still estimated that at least 1 out of every 5 Americans and Canadians are predominantly of Celtic ancestry from the nations of Ireland, Scotland, or Wales, or roughly 1 in every 4 non-Hispanic whites. And when you include those with some distant Scots-Irish heritage from the colonial era, the saturation is near universal in old stock Anglo-Americans. However, one area of the world that may be even more Celtic than the Americas would definitely be Australia and New Zealand, where the British ethnicities have somewhat coalesced into one over the generations, now known as Anglo-Celtic, and this is also true to a certain extent for Anglo-South Africans. So, as I declared in a much older video, the Celts may not have stayed relevant on the mainland of the European continent, even losing much of their cultural and linguistic heritage under the rule of the French and British. It would seem that these nations have impacted the world beyond their ancestors' wildest imaginations. So go ahead and let me know your thoughts on the Celts of America, Canada, and the rest of the world. And for today's poll, tell me which of these groups in the Americas you would like to know more about. As always, this has been Mason. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day, and I'll see you next time.